Welcome to the Hive. Today, we're diving into a surprising and sometimes little-known facet of history: animals in the service of war. So, let's talk about pigeons, those winged messengers who have been serving mankind for millennia, even under Julius Caesar. If you drop a pigeon, it will find its way back to its loft, no matter how many kilometers it travels. During the First World War, when means of communication were far from today's standards and telephone lines were still in their infancy, some troops could find themselves cut off from any means of contact. Stories of pigeons saving units are legion. Take Vaillant, Commander Reynal's last pigeon. This commander found himself and his men besieged in the Fort de Vaux, surrounded by the Germans. Thanks to Vaillant, he was able to warn headquarters of the imminent capture of the fort by the enemy. In addition to being silent, discreet and easy to feed, pigeons were even used for aerial reconnaissance missions. That's right, during the First World War, they took aerial photos. How did they do it? It was easy. You could predict the pigeon's speed and route, so all you had to do was attach an automatic camera to it. Admittedly, the results were a bit random, and the project was eventually abandoned, but still. What's the connection between a frog, a snake, and a beetle? Well, it's simple: the poisoned arrow. For thousands of years, and still today in certain tribes, the poison of these animals has been used to coat the tips of arrows, whether for hunting or warfare. With a bow or blowpipe, this makes it easier to bring down prey or neutralize an enemy. Many animals are venomous enough to provide an effective poison: snakes, frogs, beetles. In South America, some frogs are so toxic that a poisoned blowpipe dart can kill an animal the size of a tapir, and for a human, you can imagine the effect. Fortunately, the meat of an animal hunted in this way becomes perfectly edible once cooked. In Africa, certain tribes use beetle larvae, which they press onto their arrows. The poison of these larvae is just as powerful, but acts more slowly. Some large animals can take several days to succumb. Today, poisoned arrows are mainly used for hunting, but they were once real weapons of war. In other words, it was better not to pick one up. In 1398, Tamerlane, the famous Turco-Mongol warlord, decided to march towards Delhi in India. On his way, he sowed terror with more than 100,000 victims. But once he reached the gates of the city, he found himself up against a formidable obstacle: hundreds of war elephants, equipped with armor and spikes on their tusks. So, you might imagine that Tamerlane would send his best archers to aim at the elephants' eyes and neutralize them, right? Well, no. Tamerlane has another idea in mind: to capture these elephants and integrate them into his own army. Here's his plan. He gathers together a dozen camels and sets their tails on fire. The result? The camels charge towards the elephants, screaming in pain and causing panic among the pachyderms. Panic-stricken, the elephants retreat and ravage their own camp as they flee. Behind them, Tamerlane and his army moved forward, exterminating the last defenders and capturing the elephants for himself. As for the city of Delhi, it will be razed to the ground, and many of its inhabitants massacred. This isn't the only time flaming animals have been used to wreak havoc. In ancient times, armies also used flaming pigs to repel war elephants. These pigs were covered with tar, spears, and olive oil, then set alight. The pigs' shrill cries frightened the elephants into flight. Another example: in an ancient book, the 36 Chinese Stratagems, it is said that during the Southern Song period, monkeys covered in straw and oil were set alight and released into the enemy camp. The monkeys caused chaos, lighting fires all over the place and creating panic among the opposing soldiers. Let's move on to a story about rats, but not just any rats. Overtrained rats specialized in a very specific mission: mine detection. Over the past few years, a Belgian NGO has embarked on this crazy project. They train the rats, then deploy them to mine-affected areas such as Angola, Mozambique, and Cambodia. And what's worse, it's really effective. Unlike metal detectors, these rats detect explosives directly, so they don't stop at every rusty nail. And all they need in return is a small reward, a banana, and they're happy. Incidentally, this NGO is also developing a technique to enable rats to detect certain diseases, such as tuberculosis, on the same principle. When it comes to mine clearance, other animals have also been called in to help, but in a rather less gentle way. During the First and Second World Wars, for example, sheep were used to clear minefields. Take the Normandy landings. The beaches were riddled with mines, and rather than train sheep like rats, the army used a simple, brutal method. They'd drop a flock into an area to be demoned. The sheep would walk over, jump on the mines, and boom, no more mines. And no more sheep, really. In the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, the USSR and the USA were far from friendly, and spent their time spying on each other. It was against this backdrop that the CIA launched an operation as ingenious as it was surprising, dubbed Acoustic Kitten. The idea? Spy on the Soviets using a cat. Yes, just a cat. They implanted a microphone in its body, a transmitter, and even an antenna in its tail. Tens of millions of dollars were invested in this project. And for what, in the end? Not much. The plan for the first mission was to discreetly eavesdrop on two men near the Soviet embassy in Washington. Everyone's in place, the cat's out in the field, and paf, hit by a cab as soon as the mission had begun. This is how a $20 million project ended up in the wheels of a car. Bat Bomb? No, it's not Batman's latest gadget, but an American project developed during the Second World War. So, what did it involve? Simple. You take a bat, attach a small time delay incendiary bomb to it, and drop it over a Japanese village at dawn. Seeing the sunrise, the bat would sit back and hide, except that most Japanese buildings were made of wood or flammable materials. The result? Fire everywhere. Imagine containers filled with 1,000 bats, installed in a bomber capable of carrying 100. If you drop 10 bombers like that over a city, you're talking about 1 million pyromaniac bats in flight. In theory, the idea sounded brilliant. The Americans had even built a Japanese village to test the concept, and it worked. Well, except when a few bats escaped and went to hide under a gas tank at an airbase. Not the best of surprises. The project was eventually abandoned, not because it didn't work, but because it couldn't have been ready before the summer of 1945. Far too long to set up. And honestly, when you see the idea, you think Batman is still a much better invention for using bats. So, let's talk about dogs. Not just the classic attack dogs, used for centuries, no. Today, we're going to talk about bomb dogs. Yes, just like explosive bats, but this time the idea isn't American. It comes straight from a Soviet project. The plan? Relatively simple, but downright dark. First, a dog is deprived of food for several days. Then, when he is finally allowed to eat, his bowl is placed under a tank. Once the dog has mastered this little exercise, it is sent to the front, with a time bomb strapped to its back. Logically, the dog is supposed to run under enemy tanks and blow them up, at the cost of his own life. Unfortunately, the problem is that this plan doesn't go according to plan. Already, as the dogs had been trained with Soviet tanks, some of them failed to distinguish enemy tanks from their own, and ran right under the friendly vehicles. And in many cases, the dogs panicked at the noise of the fighting and turned back, towards their own camp. Imagine the chaos. Even so, according to Soviet sources, these dogs destroyed over 300 tanks during the war. And so we come to the end of this fascinating journey behind the scenes of history, where spy pigeons, mine-clearing sheep, and fighting elephants have played unlikely but crucial roles. These stories, sometimes heroic, sometimes bewildering, show just how much animals have been called upon for missions far beyond what we might imagine. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, to subscribe, and above all, to share your anecdotes or unusual facts in the comments. We'll be back very soon for another dose of curiosity, but until then, stay curious,